Well, patch 1.13 has just dropped for Shadow of the Erdtree some 20 odd days after the last patch. And in this video, we're going to go through what those changes are, what the highlights are, and the important bits that you need to know. There are a lot of bug fixes in here that are not super relevant, but let's get into the most important changes of this patch. So first up, there's some PvP exclusive balancing adjustments with equipment, skills, and spells. So let's start with the equipment first. Increased poise damage of normal attacks of the following weapon types: light great swords, backhanded blades, hand-to-hand arts. Beast claws increase the poise damage of dual-wield attacks for the following weapon types: straight swords, thrusting swords, curved swords, katanas, spears, whips, fists, and claws. Increase the poise damage of claws of knight throwing attack. And decrease the backstab invulnerability window when using the fine crucible feather talisman or the talisman of all crucibles equipped. So I'm not a PvP player, but my assumption based on these changes is that a lot of players were shying away from these weapon types, particularly dual wielding, simply because that they were losing trades, right? Like they were trading into a player and they couldn't interrupt their attacks with their faster attacks, so they would lose trades to higher damaging, slower attacking weapons. So I'm assuming this changes to bring these weapons more on par so that players using them aren't always losing every trade. Additionally, it looks like a lot of players are using the Fine Crucible Feather Talisman and Talisman of all Crucibles because that provides the same buff that Fine Crucible Feather Talisman does, which basically makes you invulnerable when you backstep, which you currently aren't. You don't have iframes by default on your backstep. A lot of great attacks for weapons come out of a backstep, and if you can wait till the last possible second and backstep out of an attack and then follow up instantly with an attack, that's very, very deadly. So my guess is this changes to try and reduce that from being the meta gameplay. So other changes to PvP: Savage Lion's Claw, the follow-up attack with the second hit of the follow-up attack is now easier to land on players. I'm assuming the tracking is better, but the damage has been reduced on the first attack against players. Raging Beast has had its invulnerability window against other players reduced. I'm guessing that was being abused. Blind Spot obviously has a huge iframe window. That has been reduced in PvP as well. And Palm Blast, the amount of poise damage generated by it has been reduced when charging the skill, so I don't think you're going to be able to interrupt players as easily with it anymore. Other changes: Miriam's Vanishing, decreased invulnerability window against other players' attacks. I know this was very heavily used in PvP, so be curious to see how that is now. Knight's Lightning Spear, the attack power of the initial Lightning Spear has been increased, but the subsequent attack power of the spears launched and poise damage of all spears from this spell has been reduced. So it should probably deal less damage overall and make it so that it's more important to land that first hit rather than the follow-up spears. Moving on to general balancing adjustments: increased damage animation of the light greatsword charged attacks against enemies. So this is going to deal more damage. It doesn't boost other player damage. That's a nice buff. Increase the stats and statuses of some NPCs: Needle Knight Letta, Pureblood Knight Anspac, Foliar. They've all been buffed, so when you summon them, they're going to deal more damage. Increase the attack power and damage negation of summoned spirits, excluding Mimic Tier when Revered Spirit Ash Blessing is 5, and then again increased it at 8 or higher. So my guess is that everyone's using Mimic Tier still. I know I used it through the DLC on my first playthrough. And what they're trying to do here is buff other summoned spirits so that players will use them more effectively. And if you scroll down, you'll notice there's an Ash section that basically shows almost every single Spirit Ash has been buffed. Some of them just won't stagger as easily, but others have had HP increased, attack power increased, both HP and attack power increased. There's huge buffs to just about every Spirit Ash. So if you got tired of using Mimic Tier because every other Spirit Ash was basically garbage compared to it, you might want to check some of them out now and see how they are. Moving along to equipment that was buffed or nerfed: the attack power scaling when upgrading the following armaments has been increased: Repeating Crossbow, Spread Crossbow, and Rabbath's Cannon, so those have been buffed. Shield of Night has increased damage negation when blocking physical attacks. This is great. It's made it really hard to use when blocking this. This means that our Void Knight build has been buffed a little bit. Euporia, the Twin Blade, got buffed, increases the holy damage when the weapon has its luster restored. It decreases the number of attacks required to restore it, and also increases the duration of the buff. This is fantastic. Our Divine Warrior build takes advantage of this weapon. Now it's even easier to play that build. The Golden Lion Shield has had its guard strength increased, making it easier to block attacks. The Golem Fist has had hitbox to the hand portion of the ranged fist attack, so I'm assuming if you use this point blank now, you're going to get the hand attack and the ranged attack in one, which is nice. The Spread Crossbow is nerfed a little bit. It's decreased the general status buildup when using bolts that have status effects, so it's not going to be as easy to trigger status effects with anymore. And the Ailment Talisman has been buffed a bit. It says after the onset of a status ailment, the status buildup or duration of said ailment will now also be reduced immediately by a certain amount. That might actually be kind of useful. Skills that were buffed increased the attack power and poise damage of the first attack of Savage Lion's Claw, so our Savage Slasher build has now been buffed since it takes advantage of that. Swift Slash has been nerfed, reducing the overall movement distance and extending its recovery time, making it slightly harder to use. Overhead Stance has increased its attack power against enemies, not players, so that's good because that was kind of a weaker Ash of War. Here's one I know players have been asking for: Aspect of the Crucible Wings, increased attack power, increased directional control, as well as the amount of poise generated when using the skill, so it should be harder to be interrupted when using it. Lightspeed Slash, the additional light attacks are now affected by the attack power and ability scaling of the weapon, so if you were using Radahn's Greatsword Light, then this is probably better than it was before. Rancor Slash has had the increased attack power of its Vengeful Spirits and increased stamina damage against guarding enemies. I tested this out a little while ago. It was very weak, so I'm curious to see how this is now. Otherwise, it's just kind of like a more expensive sword dance that's not quite as good, so we'll see how that is. Revenger's Blade has had increased directional control for follow-up attacks after a strong attack. That should make this easier to use. Both Horn Calling and Horn Calling Storm have had their attack power increased. I've tested both of these weapons and decided not to make builds with them because of their weaker attack power. I will probably revisit those now. Weed Cutter increased the speed of attacks. If you like using Roxasha's Great Katana, this should be even better now. Romina's Purification increased poise value when using the skill. Red Bear Hunt increased attack power, increased poise values when using the skill. That should make it easier. Rancor Shot decreased status effect buildup when using arrows that have status effects. That's a slight nerf to Rancor Shot, which kind of sucks. Repeating Fire adjusted attack power to compensate for increase in weapon damage. I'm assuming this means now that this weapon skill is going to be, the damage has been toned down because of its improved upgrade power. Feebled Lord's Frenzied Flame reduced frenzy status effect buildup against enemies, so that's a bit of a nerf. And Revenge of the Night increased poise damage and attack power when using this skill immediately after guarding against enemies' attack. Again, we use this Shield Knight in our Void Knight build, so that also buffs that build a little bit. Moving on to spells, Glint Blade Trio has had its attack power increased. Blades of Stone has had the first of the charged attacks, that hit its damage increased, the non-charged attack power increased, but the follow-up second and third attacks deal less damage. It also has increased attack range and attack speed, so it should be a little bit better than it was before. And that's going to make our Gravity Sorcerer build even stronger, I think. Glintstone Nail and Glintstone Nails have increased attack power and improved enemy tracking. We used both of these in our Maternal Mage build, so that build has been buffed. Impenetrable Thorns. All generated Impenetrable Thorns will now track enemies. It has decreased attack power and poise damage, and the Hemorrhage status effect and damage against guarding enemies has been nerfed. So this is a huge nerf to this spell. I think a lot of people saw this one coming. It was a bit overpowered. Rings of Spectral Light increased attack power and frostbite status effect buildup, and Vortex of Putrescence increased attack power and frostbite status effect buildup. I've tested both of these spells. Both are very weak. They look awesome. They look really cool, but they're just not that effective compared to other spells. Probably have seen, or you will see in our All-Knowing Sage build, that there are just other spells that are just better at this point. You might want to include some of those in that build. Minor Erd Tree increased HP recovery amount. Land of Shadow improved enemy tracking. Spira increased attack speed. Waspful Spirit improved enemy tracking. Divine Beast Tornado increased attack power. Enemies hit by the tornado will now be launched upward, knocking them into the air. The tornado will be less likely to disappear due to collision with terrain. This is a huge buff to this spell. I've seen reports online that this is doing upwards of 3k if you hit with all of it, which can be great. Rain of Fire has been buffed, increasing its attack power, reducing the interval between each hit. You'll have seen in our Mesmer Fire build that we didn't really use the spell because it was so weak. It was clearly bugged. That's been patched. You should include that in that build if you're using it. I've heard it's doing really well right now. Roar of Rugalia increased poise damage and attack power, so that should be better. Furious Blade of Ansbach has increased attack power, and it now applies Hemorrhage, so that bug's been fixed. Rotten Butterflies increased Scarlet Rot status buildup, reduced the interval between damage ticks, and increased attack range. This is a really good buff. This desperately needed it. And there are a slew of bug fixes here. Probably the most notable, in my opinion, are that they've adjusted the placement of NPC summon signs in certain boss fights. They've also made it now so that you can summon NPCs or some NPCs with one button press instead of two, making it easier to summon them. Another bug fix is to mimic Tyr when casting spells, incantations, and using skills, fixing its behavior. And I'm guessing this is because sometimes it just wouldn't do things it's supposed to. There are several performance issues and other bug fixes. Hopefully the performance issues help with the game kind of stuttering sometimes in boss fights and grabbing. Hopefully that's been improved. It's definitely better than when it first launched, but a little bit more would be better. So that wraps up the changes for patch 1.13. I think overall most of these changes are good. Most of the nerfs I think are warranted. Most of the buffs definitely need to happen or were because of bugs, and some bugs were fixed. I think this is a good amount of changes for a patch. You do too much more than this and you risk unbalancing the game the other way. So I think we can expect more patches in the future of about this size, which is great. Another thing that I'm always really happy to see when I see patch notes like this is that a lot of our builds have been improved rather than nerfed. I don't like making builds that are clearly taking advantage of exploits or bugs that will be patched in the future. Playing them while you can sort of builds. I like making builds that excel anyway, and then when you know something isn't working as intended, like Rain of Fire, for instance, you can add it into the build, and then it gets stronger. Or Euphoria, that build, the Divine Warrior, is a tough build to play, but now it's even better to play. So I really, really like that, and I'm glad to see that these changes are happening. And I want to test out some of these Ashes of War now that have been buffed again and see if they're more viable. So what do you guys make of the patch changes? I think it's pretty good overall. I think the general community will find these good changes. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below.